Welcome back to FatbossTV. We're back from another set of raid testing, and today we're looking at Vectis from Uldir on the battle for Azeroth Beta.
Yes, this two-phase encounter appears to be the fifth boss in the instance, and the whole theme of the fight is debuff and ad management in phase 1, and line dodging and soaking Fallen Avatar style soak circles during phase 2. With all of these boss previews, let's jump into the encounter from the start and give our thoughts and feedback at the end. So let's start off with phase 1.
So the main thing that will eventually wipe your raid in this encounter is the tank debuff. Tanks gain a stack of mutagenic pathogen pretty frequently while the boss hits them. Each subsequent application of this dot deals double damage per tick of the previous application. To start off, it deals virtually no damage, but the damage ramps up quickly, and above 10 stacks, it will begin to hit pretty hard, or at least it should. While we were testing, it wasn't scaling properly. We decided to time the debuff out at 10 stacks, but on live it's likely you'll do it much lower than that. Now this is where the issues begin when the debuff does time out. Whoever is closest to the tank when it expires will gain a new debuff, Omega Vector. This debuff deals ticking damage over 10 seconds, and then again will jump to the nearest player when it expires. As a result, this debuff is permanent and can never be removed. Immunities and even players dying with this debuff will not remove it from the encounter. This means by the end of the fight, a decent amount of your raid is going to have one of these debuffs ticking on them, giving your healers a large amount of raid damage to deal with. This is made worse because every time Omega Vector jumps from you, it will also apply a new debuff, Lingering Infection. This permanent debuff increases all damage you take from Contagion by 5%. The boss casts Contagion pretty frequently, and all it does is just a small burst of damage to the entire raid. So to start off with, this is really easily manageable. However, as players start to gain higher and higher stacks of Lingering Infection from the Omega Vector debuff timing out on them multiple times, then you're going to be dangerously close to getting one shot every time Contagion is cast. This Lingering Infection debuff is also gained during phase 2, which we'll get to in a second.
So what's the best way to deal with this debuff? In our larger raid size, we decided to let it bounce randomly amongst the raid as we all stacked on a single location. If anyone at any point gained excessive amounts of Lingering Infection debuffs, they could just simply move slightly out of the group and therefore never be close enough to receive the Omega Vector debuff. This may work on live servers, it kind of just depends on how they decide to tune the Contagion damage. On Mythic, it's possible that you'll need to use a way stricter strategy so that the stacks are spread as evenly across the raid as possible. Now, being so stacked up also helps out for AoE healing, which is important because of the last ability you need to deal with in this phase, which is Gestate. The boss will fixate a single player and begin to cast on them. At the end of this cast, it will deal ticking damage to that player and anyone within 8 yards over 6 seconds, whilst also stunning that initial target. After the stun is finished, an ad will spawn from that location. This ad casts Immunosuppression. This uninterruptible cast applies a healing absorb shield to the entire raid. You simply got to out-heal it while the DPS nukes the ad down before it gets too many casts off. As the Gestate target will deal damage to anyone within 8 yards whilst being stunned so they won't be able to move, we assigned a single location on the other side of the boss for players to quickly move to when they're targeted. Otherwise the raid would just take a shit ton of ticking damage, and when these ads do spawn, the tanks do need to pick them up because they actually deal quite a lot of damage with their melee hits. After cycling through those abilities for so long, the boss will then transform into a pool of blood and move to a random location within the room. This is the beginning of phase 2.
So there are two things you must watch out for here. The boss himself, if you stand within the circle, will actually apply Lingering Infection debuffs, but more importantly you need to watch out for the blood geysers that are flying out the boss. If you're hit by one of these, you'll take a large amount of damage, but again also gain an application of Lingering Infection. Now the issue with these geysers is that they're not too easy to dodge unless you're far away from the boss, as they move so quickly and have no real spawning animation to give you an idea of what direction they're going. However, the main issue is the hypergenesis circles. These circles will explode after 8 seconds, each dealing a burst of damage to the entire raid. If you have 2 of these go off, it will almost certainly be a wipe. However, if a single player stood within them, they will not explode, and instead the player will take a much smaller burst of damage. The damage is not split, therefore you only need 1 player per circle. Now where these circles spawn seems completely random. We had them spawn far from the boss, and therefore it was easy to soak them and dodge the geyser lines at the exact same time because you have so much time to react. However, we did have them spawn almost directly on top of the boss. In this situation we used immunities to soak these close patches, but it's still far from ideal because you will still gain lingering corruption regardless if you're an immunity or not. These geyser lines do, however, only target players. They're not randomly fired throughout the room. So you could technically line up the majority of your players so the hypergenesis circles that are close to the boss are less likely to have a geyser run through them. That said, the player close to the boss who is soaking the circle is still going to find it next to impossible to dodge the lines if he is targeted. After 2 sets of circles, the boss will then congeal, and the fight will return back to phase 1, and from that point, just repeat. As the fight goes on and more tank debuffs begin to spawn even more Omega Vectors, towards the end of the encounter, people are going to drop incredibly low every time Contagion is cast. This is probably, if tuned how it was while we were testing, going to kill you before the boss does hard enrage. Expect to save healing cooldowns towards the end of the fight because on a first kill, especially on Mythic, is going to be extremely clutch. But that's the encounter. What do we think of Vectis?
So I think we should focus on the positive things first before my laundry list of negative things about this fight. So the tank debuff, although we have kind of seen it in different forms in the past, it is a cool mechanic.
Yep.
The amount of different strategies you can use to manage the Omega Vector debuffs, just to keep the lingering infection low on certain targets is almost unlimited. We considered like using some sort of square formation to keep the debuff jumping between set players, and they could use time defensives on the Contagion, but we did end up deciding against it because we had a relatively large raid size, but it might be something worth considering for Mythic. I just kind of like the whole idea that it's kind of like a personal responsibility for dealing with this thing, and you've got to kind of look at the entire raid. So if the entire raid is generally around 3 stacks and you're on 9, you're like, oh, right, I cannot take any more of these. I should, like, even just take 5 steps out. It's quite delicate, but, there is some personal play there, which is quite neat.
Healing the fight was certainly fun. I mean, finding a balance of like spot healing targets with the Omega debuff on live, also spamming the tanks because, they should actually start taking some damage then. As well as healing the absorb debuff that's active on the raid from the ad. Definitely adds variation, and I just thought overall it sort of gave a fun healing experience. But apart from those 2 things, that's pretty much where the pros stop. I would like to start off by saying I think phase 1 is slow. It's primarily just nuke the boss and nuke the ad while everyone stacks up.
Yeah.
The only movement required is from the single player that gets targeted by the gestate. This situation could be different, I guess, if there is movement required to deal with the Omega debuff, but considering its duration, it's unlikely you'll have to spend much time managing it, as the majority of the raid will need to have this debuff at some point anyway, but just simply because of how long the fight is. And that sort of brings us to the next point as well, which is the fight is long.
Yeah, on PTR, they sometimes with these kind of like single phase fights, I guess it is a 2-phase fight, but it's like based on time rather than health. They sometimes just pump up the boss's health like ridiculous amounts, and like the enrage isn't always in the right place, and of course class balance is all over the place, all that kind of stuff, taking that into account. But still, this boss is like 10 minutes or something.
Yeah,
easy.
It feels like, at least from testing, that it's probably going to be either an 8 or a 10-minute fight.
Yeah, which is nuts for, like, this is very much a, like, Varamathras patchwork-esque sort of fight. There isn't really too much going on. There's, like, one key mechanic that everyone needs to keep an eye on, but otherwise it's just, nuke the boss and nuke this ad when it spawns. And that is boring for 8 minutes.
So I'd like to urge Blizzard, please don't make this a long fight. Make it like a maximum of 6 minutes, and we can probably live with it. Any longer than that, and no one's going to be a fan of this boss. Moving on to phase 2, in regards to the geyser lines, they could probably be slowed down a little bit. I think that most people would struggle dodging them as they are now, and considering they, do a lot of damage, taking 2 of them in quick succession is probably going to kill you, and that will almost certainly happen. Alternatively, you could just change the animation in such a way so it does give some form of brief indication of where they're going, instead of a red splashy eruption on top of a red pool.
Yeah.
It's already difficult to see, so fixing that might help. One positive I would say for phase 2 is at least they've designed the soak circle so they can be countered by a single player. So there's actually no need for 5 rogues this time round.
Yeah, which is, to be honest, something will need 5 rogues.
But aside from dodging the lines and soaking the circles in phase 2, which I guess isn't too bad because it is a short phase, it feels like there could be one additional mechanic added so the players that aren't soaking circles do have something else to do.
Yeah, you normally have an ad spawn just at the end of phase 1 going into phase 2 for you to kill, but that might give you something to do for like 10 seconds or something, and then you are literally just standing around. I think if they don't change the geyser lines, and people will probably be forced to have that whole stack up strategy to bait the geyser lines away from those soaking circles, which might actually make for something quite interesting because you've got to see where they all are and maybe try and get a line going if these lines are going to remain as deadly and as quick as they actually are. But on PTR we kind of just winged it, and to be honest it was good enough, so I know maybe they need to make them even harder to deal with to actually make that phase more challenging.
But to end our feedback on a positive note, I would like to say that I'm very excited to try, I think you are as well, to try this out on Mythic. The main changes are when you reach 10, 20 or 30 stacks of the lingering infection, different things will happen to that player, such as ads spawning, them just doing raid-wide damage. So you really need to manage those Omega stacks, otherwise it's going to fall to pieces really, really fast. So yeah, really excited to test that. But apart from that, I think the boss is a little underwhelming.
Yeah.
And we're not overly impressed. But everyone has their own opinions. If you tested this boss, Let us know what you think in the comments.
That's all we got time for today, guys. Thank you very much for watching. If you did enjoy this video, then throw a like on it. It helps us out a lot. And of course, a big extra thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon. You guys are absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you'd like to join this awesome group of people that you see on screen now, then a link for our Patreon can be found in the description. Thank you very much for watching, guys, and we'll see you next time.
Catch you later.